Now that we've decided to use Kendo UI for our application, let's take a look at what's available. If you go to Telerik.com, under Products, you'll see Kendo UI and then UI for Angular. Let's click on that. And then go to Demos. On this page, you'll see all the popular components right at the top. And then if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see all the available components under the Components section. Then under Styling, you'll see icons, the theme builder, and the different themes that are available. Under the Common Features section, you'll see how to integrate this into your Angular application with all the modern building tools that are available, including Webpack, and that includes AOT and tree shaking. And finally, under Project Setup, you'll see how to use this library with the latest Angular CLI. And if you're not using the latest Angular CLI, you have instructions on how to set this up manually. We'll briefly take a look at this a little bit later. Let's look at the components that are available. This documentation is very comprehensive. And if we click on buttons here, you'll see all the available options for buttons. The buttons package contains the button component, the button group component, drop-down button, and split button. The overview page for this particular group of components has basic usage information, an example, as well as the source code for the example that shows you how to implement this in the most basic way. And in most cases, you have this open in dropdown where you can open up a code sandbox environment that will allow you to try out and manipulate the component right inside your browser. Open in StackBlitz is just another environment that does essentially the same thing. You have your installation instructions, which we'll review in the next lessons, and a list of dependencies that are going to get installed when you install this package. This is further broken down into each individual component and instructions about each individual component. So for example, under button, you have overview of button. You also have the basic usage and examples, functionality, the events that can be triggered, and different ways to style this button and to render it. And just like the buttons group, you'll see similar instructions for every component and every component package that comes with Kendo for Angular, including charts, data grid, dialogues, drop-downs, inputs, layouts, menus, and so on. In this course, we're going to be using just a few of these to make our application really shine, but the workflow that we're going to be using is going to be essentially the same for any of the components that you decide to use in your own applications. For any of the Kendo Angular components, there are several ways to install them. If you head back out to Components and then go down here to Project Setup, tap on Using with Angular CLI. The instructions tell you how to install each of these packages using the latest approach, which is to use the progress schematics with the Angular CLI. This is by far the easiest way to install any of the packages here. But there's also the manual way of doing the installation, and that works for the earlier versions of Angular as well as projects that don't use the Angular CLI. Let's look at the documentation of installing the button components using the manual setup method. I'm going to click on Components here, Buttons, Installation, and I'm going to show you the manual setup first. If you want to install the button components, you need to install the buttons package, and this is simply done using npm. All the packages listed here will need to be installed, so just be sure to get all of them using the convenient copy button. By installing this package, you'll get the button group, the drop-down button, and the split button, and so on. Everything that's in the package, all available for you to use. After all these packages are installed, you're going to import the Kendo buttons utility array in your standalone component, making the entire component group available for you to use. But you can also import individual components, such as the Kendo drop-down button, as seen in the example here, if you only need one component. So that's the manual process of installing the buttons package. Next, we're going to look at the automated way of doing this, and that's using the Angular CLI ng add command, which performs all of those steps for you automatically. Let's do that next. Since our original RPS tracker application used the Angular CLI and we used the latest version of Angular, we're going to continue using this approach even with Kendo for Angular. So when we install components, we're going to use this ng-add command to leverage the Kendo for Angular schematics that are going to automate a lot of the setup process for us. In the last lesson, I showed you how this can be done with a button, but if you take a look at any of the components available, you'll have similar instructions. For example, here's charts. You'll see all the different charts available, and under installation, you'll see ng-add progress/Kendo Angular charts. With just that one line, you're able to bypass a lot of setup and boilerplate. For example, if we take a look at the manual setup for charts, you'll see that we're installing a lot of packages and a lot of dependencies. Let's go back to button, and now we're going to use the quick setup to go ahead and install the buttons package. I'm going to click on this copy code button, and then in my project directory, I'm going to paste that code in, and I'm going to execute this. After it's complete, let's take a look at the project and see what has changed. I'm going to take a look at package.json first, and here we'll see progress packages that have been installed. All we have to do now is just run npm install one more time so that the theme and all the peer packages are added as well. npm I or npm install, and it looks like we're up to date on everything here. Now that we have the buttons module installed, let's start using it. I'm going to go back to the terminal, and in my RPS tracker ng project folder, I'm going to use the Angular CLI to kick off the serve process so that it serves up our application. And I'm going to use -o in order to go ahead and automatically start the browser. There's our application, and we've already implemented the dashboard page. However, we don't have the chart here yet, which we'll do later. These are the buttons at the top that filter by months. I want to apply the new Kendo buttons to these buttons. And for every component that I implement, I like to start out at the documentation site just to see all the options available. Let's go ahead and take a look at the documentation, and under buttons, let's look at basic usage. I'm going to view source on this, and under app component, we can see that each button has this Kendo button directive applied to it. Right now, our buttons look like plain HTML buttons. Let's go ahead and apply the Kendo button directive to these and see what happens. I'm going to open up modules, dashboard, pages, dashboard, and this dashboard page component HTML file. This is where our group of buttons is. We're going to apply that Kendo button directive to the first button and save the file. The application should automatically restart, but nothing happens. Our button still looks the same because this Kendo button directive does not get recognized until we add the Kendo button utility array in our code. So open up the dashboard page component TS file, and up here we're going to do an import, and this is going to be coming from add progress /Kendo Angular buttons. And if you come in here in the squiggly brackets and press Control Space, you'll see all the different options we can import from there. We want to import this utility array called Kendo button. You can see that a few of them are available here, but we'll just start one at a time. So Kendo button, now we need to add that to the imports for our component to use. So right here, we're going to say Kendo button. And as soon as we do that, it gives meaning to this directive in the HTML template. Now, when we open up the running app, you'll see that our button indeed gets the Telerik UI styling applied to it. Now we can apply that same directive to the other two buttons, and let's have a look at that. Great. Let's see what else we can do. For each of the buttons, we're able to set whether they're disabled or not, and that's just the regular disabled property that we can set to true. We can add icons to them, and we'll do some of this in the theming chapter. Now, I also want to be able to let the user know which of these buttons is selected, and we can do that using a button group. If we take a look at the button group documentation, you'll see that we can group buttons and we can toggle each one of the buttons in the group. If I do view source on this, the way we can specify a group of buttons is just by wrapping our buttons in a Kendo button group element. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to wrap our existing buttons with the Kendo button group element, just like that. And because we're using another component here, we need to do a similar import from the Kendo Angular buttons package. And here it's called Kendo button group. So let's do that import as well. Put this in the imports array. And now our buttons are actually part of a group. Yet we still don't know which of these buttons is selected. For that, we're going to want to create these buttons as toggleable buttons. It's not a very easy word to say, toggleable, but that's the attribute we want to add to each one of these buttons. So if we go in here and say toggleable and set that to true for each one of these buttons, let's take a look at that. Okay, Now you can see that if I tap on one of these, I can toggle its state to on or off. But there's a little bit of a problem. Now that happens for every one of the buttons. I only want one of these buttons to be toggled on or off at a time. And that's where the group comes in handy. The button group has something called a selection mode, and it can be set to either multiple or single. If we set the selection mode of the button group to single, only one button will be able to be selected at a time. So let's add the selection attribute and set that to single on the group itself. And now I'll be able to toggle each one of these buttons and only one at a time will be selected. So now I know which button was tapped for the filter that's being shown right now. You might have noticed that some of my attributes are data bound while others are not. Either way is perfectly fine for some of these attributes. So for example, selection doesn't have to be data bound. It can just be selection equals single. There are certain attributes that do have to be data bound, and we'll go through those a little bit later in the course. So that was an example of using a button and a button group from the Kendo UI buttons npm package. This library extensively uses directives and attributes to add functionality to existing elements and custom components as well. This library is built from the ground up in Angular using all the Angular concepts like directives. So all these components are natively built in Angular, and that makes the library very performant and feel natural to use in this environment. If you're new to Kendo UI for Angular as of December of 2020, using any of the UI components from the Kendo library requires either a commercial license key or an active trial license key. In fact, if you open up the console in Chrome Developer Tools and you don't have a license key installed, you will get warnings such as this: license activation failed for each of the packages that you have imported. There's also a handy link that you can click on that gives you instructions on how to install the license key. It takes you to this page to set up your Kendo UI for Angular license key along with the explanation and very useful frequently asked questions down below. You also have GitHub Actions set up for handling your license key as an environment variable, as well as instructions for setting this up with Azure pipelines. Now in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to set up the license key using a text file. You can get to the license key by going to the downloading the license key section and clicking on the license keys link. This brings you to a handy page under your account that lists all your different licensed products. And if you have a license to Progress Kendo UI for Angular, you'll see that download link right here. Of course, you do need to be logged into your account in order to get to this page. Click on the download key link, and that'll download a Kendo UI license.txt file. And you should place that text file in the root of your project next to the package.json file. If you open your project up and you take a look at the top level directory, you'll see this Kendo UI license text file, which will just contain a string that's going to be a secret key. Now, one thing to note is that this key is something you should not include in your public Git repositories. You can include them in your private Git repositories, and certainly do not share this key. The next step is to install the Progress Kendo licensing package. Let's copy that command. In your editor, you can open up the terminal by pressing Control backtick, which will open up in the root of your project, and you can paste in that command here and run it. And finally, you need to activate the license. And you can do that with the npx command, npx Kendo UI license, and then give it the activate flag. You should see the message that says Kendo UI license imported successfully. You should also take a look at the frequently asked questions at the bottom of this license page, which will take you through some information about what to do with the license key when it expires. For example, you do need to renew the license key if you want to use a Kendo package version that has been released later than the expiration date of your current Kendo license. You'll also find notes about how to handle the Kendo UI license.txt file and also information about the environmental variable to be used instead of the Kendo UI license text file.